Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tracy. And thank you all for those who attended today. I really appreciate the presence and support. This is a part research study that I did leading up to the World Cup that is transitioned into something that we discuss in class now. And it's really focused on one, hosting the World Cup, as well as the protests, if you recall, leading up to the World Cup and during the World Cup. So it's this juxtaposition of sport versus home society or home community, as the case may be. So for our to-do list, I'm going to outline, we use a book in the class called Endgame, Ethical Sport Leadership. And that's something that was added to that class before I even arrived at UCCS through the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. And it's been a really, really interesting book to use in the class, and it helps outline a lot of really good conversations around ethics within sport and in decision-making in sport. And I'll give a little bit about that in a moment. And then I'm going to define social impact. I've noticed that different organizations define social impact differently. So sport and tourism literature defines it differently than, maybe a legal literature or something to that effect. And then using that social impact lens, I'll then discuss the Brazilian protests as the backdrop for it, and then how we use all of that information in the classroom. So with that, the first thing to start with again is what's your end game? So Pippa Grange wrote this book and breaks it down into 3 different steps in an ethical decision-making process. The first of which is the ethical elements of the situation. And these really focus on the what is going on. What is the decision that needs to be made? What are the circumstances surrounding the situation? And those sorts of elements that are attached to what the decision-making process begins with. So it's really identifying what the problem is, what the issue is, how is it being handled, what's being addressed, and that sort of aspect. The second element then brings in yourself to the equation, and that's the need to notice part. And this is where, as an individual, you think about what biases you have, what stereotypes you may hold, and those sorts of things, or what prejudice do you have towards that situation? Are you such a fan of soccer, as we get through the World Cup example? Are you such a fan of soccer that it doesn't matter what they do as long as the World Cup is actually hosted? And so your bias would lean towards soccer and supporting FIFA, which has had several different issues in the past 10 years in terms of ethical issues and corruption and things of that nature. So there may be somebody who is completely anti-FIFA in the international scope of soccer. So that's their need to notice. They have to realize what biases they bring into the table. And then finally, the last one is fairly straightforward. It's decide and do. The book talks a lot about interjecting different options and tailoring it to the situation and recognizing the ethical elements, the need to notice, and then putting that all forward and then ultimately making a decision based on the few alternatives you have. And it will also cover various ethical philosophies in the class. So we talk about, of course, utilitarianism, ethics of care, deontology, and a few others. And that also ties back into the need to notice, because it's your ethical philosophy that you're bringing to use when you make that decision. So depending on your ethical code, then you're likely to lean one way or another way. So the second part that I wanted to define for you is social impact itself. And so in the sport literature and the tourism literature itself, it's defined as the manner in which tourism and travel affect changes in the collective and individual value systems, behavior patterns, community structures, lifestyle, and quality of life. And so when we think about social impact, we're really looking at, does hosting an event change the host community? And the host community just depends on what the community actually is. And so in FIFA, for instance, it's the Brazilian World Cup. It's the Russian World Cup. We are going to be hosting the World Cup in a few years here in the United States. It's really North American, because Canada is also included. So it's what impact does that have? if you look at it more locally, things that we've done here in this community in Colorado Springs. So for instance, we have the Switchbacks new stadium, the new hockey arena on Colorado College's campus, as well as the USOPC Olympic Museum. So those also have effects on tourism and tourism engagement and the local community. So from a positive side, the tourism effect or the social impact can be increased awareness and image of the and reputation of the community. So if you think, for example, there's good data on the Olympics and what impact that has on the host community. And Calgary hosted the Winter Olympics in the 80s, and there was a research study that showed that outside of Canada, Calgary was one of the fewest named cities pre-Olympic Games. Post-Olympic Games, it was one of the most common named cities. So it elevates that image and awareness for people outside of the community, and they're much more willing to travel to that destination. For me personally, I looked at the Vancouver Olympics, and I still haven't been to Vancouver, but I want to go because of how great the community looked while it was being broadcast on TV. And so that's the effect that sport can have in terms of increasing the image and awareness of the community. And there's other positive impacts that can be created as well. So there's network relationships that can be created, which establish their ability to work together, to learn together, and grow together, and then of course do more things that draw in more tourists. So again, turning to the local community for a second, the USOPC, the museum, the city, the sport corporation, they all work together to create and design events that are going to attract people to this community to enhance the impact that it brings. There is also, many of us have heard of economic impact. There's also, from a social standpoint, there's also economic development. And what economic development does is, if you think about what's happening down near the museum in the Switchback Stadium, is you have these two beautiful new venues that are all geared towards spectators or tourists. And then if you watch around that area, you'll see more supportive things start to happen. You'll see restaurants come in, bars come in, potentially apartments and hotels come into that little subset of the city to support those areas. And that's where economic development comes into place. A good example of this from a nationwide standpoint would be Cincinnati, where they took one stadium, split them up into two. So there's now a Bengal stadium and a Red stadium. We won't get into the why they have them or should they even have them, but in between those two stadiums that they constructed, they've added in a diversity museum, all sorts of restaurants, hotels, apartments. So something that was kind of an abandoned part of the city is now a thriving area, part of the city. And that's part of that social impact side. Social impact isn't always positive though. So we do have some negative impacts associated with, in particular, mega events. So there is what's called displacement, which takes two forms of displacement. I'll go over one in a few minutes when I talk about the Brazil World Cup, but the other displacement can be displacing tourists from attending that city or going to that city during that time period. And if you think about things that happen downtown locally, when there's parades or the firefighters weekend, where there's big weekends that kind of congest that area, other people may choose not to go to that area to avoid those large crowds and those sorts of things. So that's part of the negative side. There's also a lot of literature on the increased levels of crime during mega events or even major events in certain countries. And it's because you have a bunch of people who come to an area who normally don't understand the community or the laws and the regulations, so they end up breaking laws. But then there's also people who come into the community to take advantage of those people who don't understand the norms and the cultures that occur. So there's two different levels there. The other side of that is that the enforcement of the law enforcement tends to congregate closer to the mega event centers. So then you leave open space in other areas for community to increase. So there's been a few examples during mega events where things have happened outside of the small area where the mega event's hosted within that host city or community. So those are just some of the positive and negative social impacts that may occur during events. And I think the Brazil protests tend to highlight this quite well. And so For those of you who do not remember what the Brazilian protests were all about, leading up to the World Cup, starting around 2012, 2013, the citizens were becoming more enraged about the protests, or about the hosting of FIFA and the amount of money that was spent on the actual World Cup itself. And so they were constructing 8 new stadiums, 4 renovated stadiums. So they were spending a considerable amount of money on various stadiums to host this event that was only going to happen for 2 weeks. And the citizens, to pay for this, because it was a government-run organization, they were raising taxes to force the citizens to pay for certain things so that they could then use that money to host the World Cup. So from there, the protest then began, and it all started from a simple change in a bus fare, which I'll go over in a few seconds. But the bus fare change was a huge impact on the lower income families. And so they began to organize themselves and protest against this bringing in the World Cup. And so there's a lot that has been learned from the protests in terms of the people, as well as the response to the people during the protests as well. So the first thing that happened was the bus fare increases. And so it went from 5 cents US to 10 cents US, which in terms of bus fares in our culture, that may not sound like a lot. However, it was a considerable amount of money and a considerable increase to a lot of people who use the bus system pretty heavily to transport themselves to and from work. A lot of people, based on the amount they made, their living conditions, and their access to other forms of transportation, ended up losing their jobs and unable to continue their jobs because they couldn't actually afford to get to their jobs based on this bus fare increase. And so when we look at the inflation side, we start to see some of the negative side, or the negative impacts that occur. In addition to this bus fare increase, if you think about changes in your local community, so as soon as something really nice comes into a small area that may be a little bit more depressed, then housing rates go up, shopping rates go up, everything associated around that little area tends to become more and more expensive. And that attracts, higher income people, which then leads to something I'll cover in a few minutes, which is displacement of people. So this bus fare increase really was the stem of all the protests. Some even have reported or argued that if the bus fare increase never happened, then the protests would have never happened. But this actually highlighted all the other issues that they were protesting against. On the positive side, for citizens and communities, one of the things that the government did pretty close to the actual World Cup is they started to create protections around price gouging. And this can kind of go 2 different ways, because if you think about airlines, hoteliers, and various entrepreneurs, they weren't allowed to increase their prices because all of these tourists were coming in. So you could say, oh, it's a positive thing. It's benefiting the tourists. It really enhances the experience that they'll have. On the negative side, they also prevented people from making as much money as they possibly could during that 2-3 week period that all the tourists were actually engaged in that area. From the airlines and the hoteliers' perspective, they couldn't actually max out. They had max prices that they could set for their hotel rooms, and it couldn't be any more than 3 times the amount that their normal hotel rate would be. So even if the entire city was at complete capacity and they could charge thousands of dollars to stay at a hotel, they weren't allowed to, based on the max amounts that the government placed on them. The airlines actually were able to benefit quite a bit more. So when the World Cup was held there were teams that would travel to various parts throughout the entire country. So it's not like the Olympics where everything was pretty much held in Rio. The World Cup was held all over the country. And so domestic flights were limited to only domestic airline carriers. So you couldn't fly a Delta or American Airlines from Rio to Sao Paulo. You had to fly a Brazilian airline. So that actually protected the airline industry to allow them to profit even more during that time period. So that's a positive side of the equation. So when we think about displacement, I mentioned that a little bit earlier in the context of avoiding a place because there's mass crowds. is displacement. In the Brazilian culture, there are things called favelas, which is a picture of one on the left, and that's one of the nicer ones, most likely. But with the favelas, this is a very low, very impoverished area where individuals live. And the stadiums, when they were building them, typically when you build new stadiums, you tend to find the cheapest land that you possibly can. So during the lead up to the Brazilian World Cup, over 100,000 people were removed from favelas and displaced into other areas. And the 100,000 sounds dramatic until you learn that China, when they hosted the Olympic Games, displaced close to 800,000 people from just the Bird's Nest area alone. So the Bird's Nest and then the Natatorium are pretty close to each other, and that whole section displaced 800,000 people. That's a large migration of people to different areas that can affect other areas in the city as well. And so Brazil really forced people out. The other side, this is fairly new and actually only that I've read about happened in Brazil, is that it wasn't just the impoverished or the low income people who were displaced, they also displaced middle class families. So they were displaced with less than 30 days notice, meaning the government came in and said, we're taking your home, we're taking your land, and they were giving less than market value for that home. So the citizen was left homeless and got very little warning that they were going to basically become homeless. And because they didn't have enough equity or whatever the case may be in their actual home, they were completely displaced. And so the little boy in the picture to my right side of the screen, he is an example of somebody who had been displaced, who lived in a middle-class family. So they ended up putting a tent, and then in the backdrop of his tent, you can see one of the stadiums that they were building. And so this is a major impact on the local community, far beyond what we've seen at some other prior World Cup and Olympic Games when they've been hosted. So the next one is my simple slide here of the mismanagement of funds. And this really talks about the protests and what the protests became. So rather than spending close to 800, I think it's 800 trillion on both the Olympics and the World Cup, and I believe it was, sorry, 800 billion on the stadiums for the World Cup. They wanted healthcare, they wanted better education, they wanted better payment or better pay for their jobs. That's what they were fighting for with the protests, is they wanted to have the same things that the upper middle class and upper class people had in terms of basic rights and basic needs. So meeting the needs of healthcare, meeting their needs for education, meeting their needs for better paying jobs so they wouldn't have to live in impoverished communities. And the citizens began to understand that this was in fact a huge mismanagement of funds, and it was really the elite who were benefiting from this. This mismanagement of funds ties back even to what we've seen happen in the United States. When it comes to hosting the Olympic Games, Chicago has attempted to bid, Boston has attempted to bid, and there are organizations within those cities and even countrywide that fight against hosting things like the Olympics, because rather than spending money on stadiums, they want money spent on infrastructure, healthcare, etc. During the Brazil World Cup, one of the things that the government promised was a high-speed rail that would connect 3 different major cities within Brazil. I know Sao Paulo and Rio being 2 of them. I'm blanking on the third currently. The train was one of the first things to go because they didn't have enough money, they didn't have enough investment, so they immediately eliminated that train when that's something that could have benefited the entire Brazilian community and really brought the community together a lot more closely and allowed transportation to be more open and accessible to more citizens within the community. And so you have this juxtaposition of people who want simple basic needs and then people who just want to host a World Cup. And so that leads us to what we call white elephants. On the screen is now the largest parking garage in the world. I don't know if that is true, but what I do know is that the stadium that was constructed to host several of the World Cup events is now a parking garage, and that's the main use for it. There are countless examples of the stadiums that they have either made so big, so they have 40,000 seat facilities where their soccer club hosts 3,000 on average home game. The one in the rainforest area where the US played their first match, that stadium still is not in use for anything. The best use that they have come up with, but have not activated on it, is to turn it into a prison. And so we construct these $300, $400 million stadiums, or we spend $200, $300 million to renovate stadiums and increase their capacity far beyond what the actual community needs. So we leave them behind and they become what's called white elephants, because they just stand out in the community as this eyesore that we've created and have very little to no use for. The bird's nest in China for the Beijing Olympics is a great example of that as well. The only use they have some small events. They have a couple of small teams who play in that facility, but their main source of revenue are tours of the facility, and that's it. And that's a poor long-term use. The Greek Olympics, most of their facilities that they hosted there are left in disrepair and have never been used again. It's very, very rare that you see a city like Atlanta as the opposite side of this, where all of their facilities that were permanent are still in use today from the 1996 Olympic Games. The main facility was the Atlanta Braves home stadium for a long time. They recently moved to another stadium, and that's now the Georgia State's home football field. So that one has stayed in use. Most stadiums don't stay in use, and most stadiums take forever to pay off. The 1976 Montreal Olympic Games, their venue was paid off in 2012. So that gives you kind of the idea of how long these things sit around and don't really get used, which creates a huge drain on the local economy, and for sure. The other thing that wasn't very well reported about internationally, a lot of this comes from what we learned from our Brazilian contact, who could read Portuguese in terms of their papers. So what they did is they ended up increasing securitization within Brazil. So they added 10,000 new security forces. They spent $850 million just on surveillance and weaponry for their people. And the irony, I guess, of this all is that $850 million was not spent in Brazil. So all the weaponry, all the surveillance that they created, even a lot of the new security forces came from Israel, including the weaponry and the surveillance equipment came from Israel as well. So Israel really benefited from the Brazilian World Cup. The second part of this is the lasting presence of this surveillance and weaponry that is left with this law enforcement, if you will, that's left behind. So a lot of the security forces, because the protests were so violent at certain times, they remained through the Olympic Games, which were held 2 years later, and then continued to stay for the next 4 years. And that was the last time that I checked. So they're likely still there, but that's a huge amount spent on just the securitization of the community. The interesting one, and one that got a lot of international attention, because a lot of people argue that the heart of democracy is the ability for the people to speak out against the government. And one of the things that the Brazilian government tried to do was anybody who protested against the government would be considered a terrorist. And so they had tried to pass this amendment with their government. And that's where you see the sign, no somos terroristas. I can't say it well, I'm sorry, terroristas. And they were basically saying, we are not terrorists. We are people who are speaking out for our own rights, for our own welfare, and our government isn't paying attention to us. And because the government was doing this, other governments started to monitor to see what the outcome was going to be, because that's where you get a very authoritarian type of government where they can just say, this is how we do it, and the people don't have a voice anymore. which would be anti-democratic or anti-democracy, right? And so ultimately, when they tried to do this, they received so much backlash that the amendment was withdrawn and it was never passed. And so the protesters and terrorists are not synonymous in the eyes of the law within Brazil. But this was a really interesting case in terms of taking people's voice away and taking their rights away at the same time. So all of this leads to what was the outcome? So on the left, you see Vilma, she was the president at the time. And on the right is Blatter, was the FIFA president. And so the event happens, the tournament is played, Brazil lose miserably in the semifinals, and Germany wins the World Cup. And so these two individuals who had everything to gain from this are saying, you know what, this is what's a complete success. We are so excited and we are so happy and we are so proud of this event. It was everything we wanted it to be, and it was everything that we thought it could be, and it really made a difference in the community. So if we move forward though, we also see that the Brazilian people also turned away from their own protests. So once the World Cup started, the protests actually decreased. So they were really worried in terms of the securitization, and the government and FIFA were extremely worried about the safety of players, the safety of fans, the safety of tourists because of the protests. But as soon as the games actually started, everybody started to focus on the team. And it makes sense to some regard, in the sense that Brazil is a very soccer-driven country. They love soccer. They're superior at soccer. They've won, I think, the most World Cups at this point, maybe tied. But ultimately, that's what they turned to. And then as the event went on, we started to see in news reports citizens being quoted as saying, you know, this is really great. Brazil looks amazing. We are presenting ourselves to the world. And that, again, turns back to that social impact in terms of that increased image, better reputation, better awareness. And so Brazilians were even starting to get swept up into the jubilation of the event and the success of the event, how great it looked. To substantiate that, there was a news report that I read recently where this World Cup, this 2014 World Cup, was voted the greatest of all time in terms of the competitiveness, in terms of the scenery, in terms of the spectators. It really garnered so much attention that people just loved this event. Everything from the collapse of Brazil in the semifinals to all the games that happened that really brought a lot of attention to the World Cup. On the opposite side, we see what a true measure of economy really is, the gross domestic product. It dropped from 0.5% in 2014 to negative 3.5% in 2015. So this is post-event, and it shows how the economy pretty much collapsed as soon as the World Cup was over. Now, Brazil is also tied to the oil market, and the oil market also dropped during that time. So you have this kind of combining of two different forces: one, spending so much money to host an event, and two, their main source of GDP being oil also dropping at the same time. So it really did create this economically huge impact for the country overall, and one that they still find themselves in today. So the last thing that I wanted to highlight, this is not the person who said this, I just really like his picture. There was a quote that said from someone in Brazil, the money they spent hosting this tournament should have been utilized, or better utilized. We definitely need a better life, which the money spent on the World Cup would have made possible. And that quote kind of highlights everything that the protests represented, everything that the anti-mega events people present, and really bring to the conversation in terms of, you want to host a tournament, we want a better life, we want better healthcare, we want better education, we want better housing, we want better pay. All of those things get tied into that, while the World Cup and some of the government officials are, we want to host this event. And so in class, what I end up doing with this, after discussing with the students, we turn back to the Endgame book, and really discuss what are the elements, what are people seeing that are tied into the social impact. Should we host such events? There's been a lot of talk about who should host, why do they host, what the bidding process should be. Should the Olympics just be in the same place every year, or the World Cup be in the same place every year? Should it only use countries or combination of countries that can host it without any new construction? All of that stuff starts to come up. And so we start to think about what are all the elements involved in this decision of where to host an event. The need to notice, again, as I highlighted at the beginning, can be, I'm a huge soccer fan and I just love watching the World Cup, and I don't care where it's hosted, but it's got to be hosted because it's the World Cup. And then ultimately we break out into different groups. So we have a group acting as FIFA, a group acting as the organizing committee, a group acting as the local government, because those aren't always together. And then we have groups who act as community members. And then ultimately they have a nice long discussion about whether or not they should host this mega event or really fight against it. Sometimes the class tends to, I mean, they're sport management students, so they obviously love sport. So they tend to want to host the event. But you can see in their own mindset that they're really thinking through, what is the value? What are the ethical implications of it? Should we actually be doing it? Especially in a country that may not be able to really afford it, or uses slave labor as they did in Qatar to create the stadiums. So there's a lot of good examples that we draw from. And so looking at the Daniels Fund Ethic Initiative principles, some of the things that I like to highlight with them, so I usually let them talk for 15, 20 minutes or so, and then I interject, right? So I let them kind of go through it all and discuss everything, come to an accord if they can. If they can't, that's fine too. And then I kind of go over certain things. And one of the first ones that I really like to highlight is this accountability idea. FIFA made a decision to go to Brazil. They made a decision to go to Qatar. They made a decision to go to different countries, South Africa, that may or may not have really been able to afford to host their event. And they made this decision. The IOC, compared to FIFA, does a little bit better job, at least with smoke and mirrors, and saying, we care about the community, we care about the impact that we're creating, and we want it to be positive. We want a positive legacy left behind from the Olympics. FIFA is, we want to host a soccer tournament, and that's what we're really focused on. And so when we think about the accountability measures, that's accountability for FIFA, it's accountability to the organizing committee or the government who chooses to host that actual event. And if they can't be held accountable, then maybe they shouldn't go that way. Maybe they should reinvest in a different way. The second one that I like to highlight is the notion of transparency. And what we find a lot of times in the Chicago Olympic bid is a great example of this. I actually lived near Chicago during that time period and listened to a lot of John Daly's speeches and everything like that. He was the mayor at the time. And John Daly basically wanted to host the Olympics. Like, that was his number one goal, and he didn't care how it happened. He just wanted to do it. And everything that happened was behind closed doors. And when it came time to turn around and give support to the community, or get support from the community, they basically said, nope, we're not hosting the event. And the IOC at that time saw that there was so much backlash against the local government that they just thought, you know what, we're not going there. Definitely not going there. So being transparent and open and truthful in the communications. If you think about the Brazil example, the high-speed rail, why was it canceled? Why didn't they continue it? Why didn't they prioritize that over stadium creation and things of that nature? What decisions were made to take people's land away from them? And being open in that regard. It's clear to see throughout the entire Brazilian impact that there's not a whole lot of fairness that happened, or equitable relationships that occurred. Commonly in mega events, the underserved, underprivileged, and impoverished communities tend to suffer the most. In this case that we go over with Brazil, it wasn't just them this time, it was also middle-class families. And so is that truly fair to do that to them, to take away their land, to take away all of their wealth? Then, of course, there's clear respect, respecting rights, freedoms, views. The protests speak directly to that. To be able to try and take away protesting rights away from the people in a democratic society, to me, seems like one of the most egregious things that could ever occur. But it's something that they tried to do, taking away simple rights. And then lastly, and probably the most relevant when it comes to legacy, is creating that long-term value for all relevant stakeholders. If you look at the money spent on the Brazilian World Cup, it was a malinvestment. They should have never hosted it in Brazil. The money spent changed the direction that their country was heading in terms of financially or economically. They were on a progress of improving their communities, improving their culture, or not culture, but improving their communities, improving their economic position in the world marketplace. And then shortly after the World Cup, it all came tumbling down. So that's the presentation that I have. I appreciate you listening, and I definitely welcome any questions.
Hi, my name's Visa. I'm sorry, I came in kind of late because the time change kind of messed me up. I didn't change it on my stove, so I was looking at the wrong time. So who did you say funded the FIFA, like the infrastructure building? Is that the government of Brazil that funded that, or like the actual FIFA organization?
The government funds it.
Oh, okay. Because I was just wondering because, like I said, I came in kind of like a little bit later on, but I was wondering about like the revenue that they brought in because I know with FIFA, like when they hold sports events like that, people travel from all over the world to be there, so they're spending money in that country. And if like that was mentioned and how that like applied or helped, or if it didn't help at all, I guess in a sense.
Yeah, we didn't. So when we did this research study, we didn't cover the economic impact side of it. There's clearly an economic impact when you bring in a mega event like this, because people are going to, like you said, tourists come in, they spend money at hotels, they spend money at restaurants, things like that. One of the things that I did mention about delimiting that value and that impact is that they actually placed caps on how much hoteliers could charge. They prevented certain, you had to have certain levels of permitting to sell things near stadium venues and stuff like that. So they prevented some of the economic impact that could have happened and could have helped a lot more people than what it did.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I was gonna say, like, if a country is going to dump all that money into kind of like an event like that, you would think that the reason why they would do it is because they would somehow make it back in a sense to like put it back into the economy because of tourists. So if you're looking like at a country that I guess may be like poorer, I guess, and they're hosting such a big event, yes, they might be putting money forth to do it initially, but I would think that they would get it back somehow in revenue because of tourists, and not just simply like for that event, but like a tourist that comes into that country that might not be as visited. Now they like it and they're more likely to come back and visit, not just because of the event, to kind of like make it more like a place that somebody wouldn't think on top of their head to just go visit, but it could be like beautiful or it could have a lot to offer, but a normal person wouldn't really think of that country unless something that interested them brought them there. And now it's going to open like roads to people visiting more.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely experience that in the short term. Some countries have, or some cities that have hosted mega events have also been have been able to capitalize that on the longer term. Vancouver does come to mind. They've actually been able to increase their level of tourism since they hosted the Olympics. Brazil has not seen a dramatic shift in their tourism. So arguably you could say that while yes, you do have all these people coming in, that may have just prevented, they may have just switched their time to come then, as opposed to a different time. But likely when it comes to the World Cup, people who travel for that kind of event do only travel for that kind of, for just the matches, right? So they're not going to go to Brazil later. There are good examples of leveraging the event to increase the level of tourism, to increase the level of exposure based on the event, in terms of really using it to capitalize on the exposure that you get. Brazil, in some ways, in particular in the major cities, does tend to have a negative reputation in the international level. Through this event, they did change that a bit. People did see the pretty beaches and the pretty scenery and all the things that Brazil really has to offer. But ultimately, it hasn't changed their level of tourism much. And this is pre-COVID, of course.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor?
Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question for you, actually two. So the First Amendment was my pet project in law school, so I found this topic to be particularly interesting, how you involve a major social movement in sports and athletics with combining that into political protest. And my first question is, I know that you mentioned that they struck down the act to try and make protesters terrorists, which seems extreme in many regards. My question is, though, that since then we've seen Brazil move very hard to the right, very much in the direction of Jair Bolsonaro, who is quite honestly one of the most misogynistic demagogues out there, somebody who is widely incompetent. So the question is, would a law like that, and would these protests have received even greater crackdown now? And if more political protests were to erupt in relation to sports, do you think that they would be, the government would be more successful in cracking down on them now that they've taken that direction?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a good hypothetical to think through. I would say yes, because of the movement, like you were mentioning, in their political systems. They would likely, because it's more of a win at all costs kind of mentality, and really driving in what they want to accomplish, what they want to do, rather than really worrying about the people in the country. So I could see it being even worse, and that law may have passed had the World Cup protests happen now. But then I guess the question then would be, if it did, then what's the next outcome for the citizens, right? They still get a chance to vote, and if you take away all their rights and do those certain things, would they eventually swing back to the left, or more liberal group that's more collectivist in their nature, or would they continue to vote for those people?
I appreciate it. And if you don't mind if I ask one more question, this is a bit more domestic. I think as we've seen time and time again, sports is it's such a powerful point for so many people, whether that's American football here in the US, whether that's soccer internationally. And my question is, now that we've seen domestically more protests in the form of sports, specifically the WNBA Dream, Kelly Loeffler, Colin Kaepernick kneeling, things like that, do you think that the relationship between both domestically and internationally, the relationship between sports protests and politics is going to get stronger and more numerous over time?
I do, because I believe in the Michael Jordan effect. So the Michael Jordan effect is, he basically understood that he was a brand. And I don't know if he actually said this or not, but I've read a quote before that he said, both Democrats and Republicans buy shoes. And so he said that because he would not take a position on any social issue at all, ever. And we start to see now our athletes are returning back to, the 60s athletes, the years of Tommy Smith and Juan Carlos, where they do the Black Power salute on the Olympics, after winning the Olympics, right? And so we start to see athletes, one, who understand that their voice matters. We see corporations like a Nike who are supporting athletes who are starting to speak out even more. If you haven't seen the Colin Kaepernick Nike ad, it's pretty phenomenal. And they just released another one about women, which has actually received a little bit of backlash, I know, because it centers around pregnant women and all this other stuff. And the women who competed with Nike are speaking out, basically saying, like, Kara Goucher was reported saying, you know, well, actually she posted on Instagram. So she said, you know, I didn't get that right. I didn't get any extra benefit or extra care or extra help from them. So I think with the movement, it's interesting because from some spectator side, you see the negative backlash, right? Like if I don't like what Colin Kaepernick is standing for or kneeling for, as the case may be, then I'm no longer going to associate with that league. And so it's really starting to bring to attention that athletes, one, have a voice, two, they're getting a lot of support from sponsors and corporations where they may not have in the past. And as long as that continues, then the protests and their voices won't be silenced.
I think that's a great point. This is just the last thing I'll say. Athletes as icons, and I think the reason for that is particularly if you look at LeBron James, who is one of the most internationally famous, domestically famous superstar athletes of all time, is now using much of his capital that he built in terms of sports to participate in the political arena, in fact, weighing a run for Senate. So I think that's a fantastic point of them as icons and using more of their platform in that way.
Yeah, and he's a phenomenal human, honestly, beyond his athletic prowess. He's started schools for underprivileged youth near and around his hometown. He's, you know, started all sorts of charity and supported charity organizations, candidates who speak to his mission and what he values. And he's pretty phenomenal when it comes. He's like the anti-Michael Jordan when it comes to political activism or social activism.
Could not agree with you more.
Thanks, Alex. Other questions?
Hey, Tommy, this is Spencer. Let me just see if I can get the... Thanks for the talk. I was kind of on the phone for part of it, and now I'm back home and caught the back end of it. Thanks ever so much. It was a really interesting overview. My question is really about the whole circus of mega sport events. And we're seeing more and more grossly under-costed bids that end up costing a lot more than was originally estimated or guesstimated, and grossly exaggerated benefits. And I'm interested in your views as to what it is that brings an end to this. I mean, who are the IOC, FIFA, and all of the rest of them accountable to? So that when they're getting these ludicrous legacy plans that have all of these far-fetched claims within them and these grossly underestimated costs associated with the stadiums that, you know, I take London 2012 as an example. Original cost estimates were £6 billion. It ended up costing closer to 12 billion. I mean, who brings an end to this? Who are these organizations accountable to, or who should they be accountable to?
That's a great question, Spencer. I think we've already started to see it a little bit, right? So Boston started to bid for the Olympics and then basically said, no, we're not doing it anymore. And then it turned around and LA runs to the rescue for the United States bid, right? LA can bid because LA has everything, and the one major stadium that they're funding or constructing for it is not really for the Olympics, it's for the football teams that they're bringing there, right? I mean, the only way it changes is if cities and government officials start to say it's just not worth it. Because as you said, the return on investment's not there. But then the return on investment on any sport facility that's publicly funded isn't there. And yet we continuously do it, domestically and abroad, right? So the question then becomes is, how much power do the citizens have, and how much voice do they really want to listen to the citizens? Because if they did, then we wouldn't host mega events at all. Or if they were hosted, it would be a combination of cities that could host it without major infrastructure improvements or spending. Because I think Sochi's still the worst, right? Where they were 25 billion and ended up 50 billion because it was something double what they were supposed to spend. So yeah, I think places that bid really need to focus on what they have in their inventory in terms of facilities and capacity, and be the ones who actually are allowed to bid on it.
I suppose to that end, I'd be interested in your view on some sort of integrity watchdog internationally.
Mm.
It's been muted over the past years because these organizations have so much unchecked power, FIFA and the IOC, that what we actually need is a kind of a United Nations of sport that is responsible for holding these guys to account. So when there are these major governance failures, or just these gross mismanagement of bidding, as we see with the FIFA World Cup and the Olympic Games, that there's some sort of accountability. There's some checks and balances that these organizations are responsible for at the end of the day. What is your view on kind of that type of mechanism?
I hadn't thought about it, but it's an interesting proposition. Because I mean, the Qatar World Cup is phenomenally egregious. I don't know if you heard me say that earlier, but the scandals with the bribery, the way the facilities were constructed, the long-term use, the after use, I guess I'll say, because they have no plan after the event. So they're literally building all these stadiums and they're going to do absolutely nothing with them. And some of them are pretty phenomenal looking stadiums. But no after effect, no after plan. Then should we really be playing soccer when it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit? I wouldn't want to play in that. I didn't like playing soccer in Texas when it was 100 degrees. So the watchdog group is interesting because if you look at sport, we do that in other arenas, right? When it comes to anti-doping, we have WADA, USADA, kind of that governance structure that I think you're talking about a little bit as well. So would it be worth doing something where the bidding process works through some organization? We would hope that the IOC, FIFA, and the other World Cups that are hosted are their own watchdogs, but clearly that's not the case.
Thanks, Tommy.
Thanks, Spencer.
Hi, Thomas. I just want to follow up on Spencer's sort of series of questions. I'm Jen Kling. Hi.
Hi.
So it strikes me that like one of the background issues here is who's responsible for sort of where the decisions regarding where these mega events get hosted and sort of subsequently put on, right? Because you can imagine the IOC sort of saying, look, we just opened the floor for bidding, right? If LA bids and then it's a disaster, like that's on them, right? Like we ought not be trying to tell a city or a country or what have you, it's business, right? But contrastingly, right, you could also say to FIFA or the IOC or what have you, like you ought be taking care in whom you open the bidding to, right? And so I'm wondering how much you think this partially comes down to questions of responsibility, right? Of like where the line should be drawn in terms of who's responsible for these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, and I mentioned this briefly, and some of what you're talking about to me is a little bit of the difference between the IOC and FIFA. FIFA seems to be very much of the mindset, our job is to host a tournament, and that's what we're going to do. If you're willing to bid on it and we like your bid more than we like the other people or other countries' bids, then we're going to host it there. The IOC has written into their proposals and their bidding that you have to have a long-term legacy. To Spencer's point, what they propose and what actually happens is very, very unlikely and uncommon to occur. But they at least give it some thought that there is going to be a long-term plan post-event to either increase sport participation, to increase use of facilities, to have use of the major facilities they build. So they at least say they want it, whereas FIFA doesn't seem to have that same language in their proposals. Following up on kind of what you said, and that's what I was saying earlier, is I think it's the citizens and the civic leaders of the host community's decision to say, this isn't worth it. Boston made it all the way through, was the USA, the host city for the USA in that bid. And as they were getting ready to bring it to the IOC, they pulled out because their citizens said, no, we're not doing this. Everything you're saying is going to happen isn't going to happen. and where you're spending the money isn't what our community needs. There's a no games, and then fill in the city blank of those who are bidding for it. Like there's a no games LA currently right now. There was a no games Chicago. I believe that's where they started. And that's what their whole funding and what they do, or purpose of what they do, is to bring to the attention and the minds that the communities don't need to bring in these huge events. They would be better served doing so many other things than hosting mega events that would really benefit the city and the community a lot more, because there's no real true long-term plan to keep that investment going. I hope that answered your question, Jen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Thank you. So then I guess the sort of maybe natural follow-up to that question, as like a longtime World Cup fan, I can't believe I'm asking this, but should we even be having these kinds of mega events, right? I mean,
yeah,
bread and circuses. Should we strive as a society to like move away from World Cups, Olympics, things like this because of all these problems?
That's a great question. I think you're a former D1 athlete, right?
Yeah, I am.
I thought so. We started at UCCS together, I believe.
Yeah. So I can't even believe I'm like saying this out loud, but it seems to follow, right?
I mean, I get you. Like, I love college sport. Like, I'm a huge fan of college sport in general. And then I learned what the NCAA does to host communities that host, a regional tournament.
Yeah.
Like the bet. So to speak to that just very briefly, they require hoteliers to pay them a certain percentage of what they would make on a hotel room stay. And so the hoteliers in the host communities, they give away so much through their sport corps or convention, visitors bureau, whomever's putting together that bid, they give away so much that they're starting to lose money hosting events, which is just backwards, right? The whole purpose of hosting an event is to increase the income, increase exposure, and all that stuff, but it's not happening. To go to the mega events, I mean, the Olympics is centered around bringing the world together, right? There's some positive things that happen during the Olympic Games. In terms of cultural understanding, cultural awareness, things of that nature still occur. I'd say FIFA less so, because it really is centered around soccer and the fans, the spectacle of soccer fans. I don't know. I would say we should keep them, but we should change how we manage them. I do like the idea of multi-site Olympics. I like the idea of, if we're going to host it, let's host it in one place every 4 years, or even maybe rotate it to like the different hemispheres every 4 years. So there's a limited number of places that do it, so they can really invest in it and really benefit from their investment that they put to it. I don't know, I'm too much of a sport fan to say no. I really am. I'm tiptoeing around it, but I'm too much of a sports fan to say get rid of it. Like you probably. I struggle with it. Like I struggle with college sport in general at this point. But I still love to watch it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I hear you, right? I'm the same way. I'm like, don't take my sports from me, but like, oh wow, it's not good. But no,
Yeah.
I like some of the suggestions for how to move forward. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I remember when I was doing my doctoral program, I remember one of my faculty members saying, I barely watch sport anymore. I pretty much, I read the news, watch the news. Like sport to me is just, it's just not what it used to be. And I was like, that will never happen to me. I mean, I was at ESPN all day long kid, right? And now I very, very, very rarely have ESPN on my TV. Though tomorrow is my national holiday because it's the opening day of the basketball tournament.
No, that's sacred. That's fine.
I mean, I did grow up in Durham, North Carolina, so I am a Dukey by heart and Virginia Tech by graduation. So I'm sad the Blue Devils aren't in the tournament, but I still have my Hokies to cheer for.
See, that's what you got to do. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I love it. Cool. Thank you so much, Thomas. I've got to run. I've got another meeting, but I really
You're
appreciate it.
Thank you for your questions too.
Yep.
Yeah. And this is Tracy, and I want to second Jen's comment about thank you very much. And we did end up having some good questions and really appreciated your presentation. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. And I appreciate the opportunity as well. And in addition to the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative and this whole process that we're going through this year, it's been great.
Yeah. Okay. And so I did put in the chat to look at some future events coming up. And with that, we can all have a great rest of the day.